We begin, though, with developments about the former president's rough time in court over fraud today. Closing arguments underway in the civil fraud case against Trump and his two eldest sons and the entire allegedly fraudulent Trump organization. As you can see, Trump himself in attendance. He's been in a lot more courtrooms than campaign events this week, and he turned towards cameras every time he could. He lashed out at the judge and the attorney general who's brought this case quite effectively all the way through trial. And he did his Festivus set of grievances. Indeed, there were closing arguments on behalf of Donald Trump by attorneys Chris Kise and Alina Habba, and Trump himself got involved briefly. Now, as we reported on this very program yesterday here on MSNBC, Donald Trump is a civil defendant here. His request to speak during closing arguments or give some sort of grandiose closing statement, that was denied by the judge for a very simple reason. Donald Trump's own lawyers basically refused the rules that would bar personal attacks. You can see some of the court sketches as that was all dealt with. Now, the judge addressed Donald Trump's side today in a follow-up, basically demanding, under the rules, that any comment that Donald Trump issued, even if not a formal full closing argument, would have to be limited to the, quote, facts and law. And Trump, who you can see in these sketches, basically started a sort of a rant. He called the case itself a fraud. He's the one, of course, on trial for fraud. He began attacks on the attorney general and the judge, who then instructed Trump's lawyer, and this just happened today, to, quote, control your client. So Trump got off about 5 minutes of that before the judge completely cut him off. It was more theatrical than legal in terms of how best we can understand any impact on this fraud case or the punishment that Trump, his sons, or the organization may face. Now, during the closing arguments, which are set to wrap up soon, we can also report for you that the New York State lawyers reiterated their case. Attorney Kevin Wallace saying Trump's team had the requisite intent, that it's clear they set out to do what they did when it came to this alleged fraud, which includes lying, falsifying many years of financial statements when numbers don't lie. Now, when Wallace called Trump's witnesses a, quote, murderer's row of experts, Chris Kise objected, and Wallace said it was a baseball reference, not the more chilling references we've heard in other courtrooms to actual murder. Let's get to it with our experts today. Former top prosecutor from the DOJ, Andrew Weissmann, and New York Times investigative reporter Sue Craig, who was inside the court for us today. She is actually so inside the court that we don't have her on screen yet, Andrew. You know how that works. You've had reporters who have to play by all those rules and then come on out. Big picture for folks who are catching back up, Andrew, with or without any comment you want to make about the defendant Trump's outburst, what is happening as they close up the rest of this case here on the fraud?
I think the big picture is sort of twofold. One is, I think it's the bomb scare at the outset of this morning, which was there was a bomb threat to Judge Engoron. And the reason I say that is, you know, if you step back, we are seeing repeated acts of threatened violence to people who are part of the either state or federal legal system, whether they be prosecutors, judges, family members of those people. And again, today, it started that way with, you know, without the sort of hue and cry that you would expect in a civilized society from both sides about violence not being anything that it should be called for regardless of political party or what your role is in this case. So I sort of start with that because it's very easy to get inured to what is going on. With respect to the facts, I think both sides are basically reiterating themes that they have made during the case. Their briefs are actually, both sides are very good in articulating their own position. And so you're sort of getting a nutshell of that today, but orally, with some indications from the court as to where the court is interested. I thought the most interesting thing was when Judge Engoron commented that even if there is only one witness to something, Donald Trump's lawyers said, well, that means you have to accept that as given because it's not been rebutted. And Judge Engoron said, not necessarily if I think that the witness is not credible. And the reason that's important, if he makes credibility findings, if the Judge Engoron makes credibility findings, because this case will definitely be appealed by one side or the other, likely Donald Trump, because it seems like this is going to go, against him. Those credibility findings are extremely hard for a court of appeals to overturn. There is enormous deference to the judge's findings. So I think that's a sign of both what Judge Engoron may do and how tough it will be for Donald Trump to get the decision that he makes overturned.
All really striking. Stay with us, Andrew. Sue has emerged from the courtroom. Welcome. And what happened today?
Thank you. Well, it's been, I got to say, it's crazy down here on a number of levels. You got the Trump case going on. I was in the hallway. I ran into Wayne LaPierre from the NRA. It's a busy day. And this morning, we've talked about it. The Team Trump was up and gave their side of the case and what's going on. There was a lot of theater, especially when Donald Trump got up. And then this afternoon, I think we've seen a more calmer version of events of the case from the Attorney General's side. And they've sort of methodically now, they're going through their case. They're starting off by saying, look, there was fraud. These statements of financial condition that were submitted to the banks, they're fraudulent. And then they just calmly went through, it was interesting, each witness and said why that witness was not credible. They had a slide on the projector with each witness's picture, and then they went through it. And I have to say, though, one of the more interesting parts of the afternoon, at least for me, I was wrapped by it when the Attorney General's lawyers started to present a case as to potentially why Donald Trump needed these lower interest loans. The argument has been that he submitted these statements of financial condition in order to get better rates at the banks, these fraudulent statements of financial condition. And they went through some of the spending that Donald Trump has been doing recently, and there has been a lot of renovations done, particularly at 3 properties. He put $250 million into Doral. Turnberry spent $300 million on it. And the old post office, it was $225 million on renovations. And the picture that the Attorney General painted this afternoon in court was that Donald Trump was, in fact, facing a cash crunch. And this is important for 2 reasons. One is the argument is that he needed the savings that he was getting from these favorable loans, because if not, his net worth would have fallen below, his cash would have fallen below a certain point that he wouldn't have been able to get lending from these banks potentially. And then secondly, I was listening to it because he is coming into a judgment with this judge of penalties going up to $370 million. We're looking in the hundreds of millions of dollar range. And the picture that was painted by the Attorney General this afternoon of his cash position is not good. And it also supports a lot of the analysis that we have done at the New York Times, that he doesn't have a lot of cash on hand to meet a penalty of that size, and that he is looking potentially, this is going to be a ways out because it's going to the appellate court, but he's going to be looking at having to sell assets in order to pay that fine when that day comes.
Yeah, speak more about that, because this is a legal proceeding where the information you're referencing is designed to prove the exact points of the Attorney General, the government side. This isn't, for example, a Forbes article where they're deciding where you rank on a billionaire list, or someone on the internet saying, oh, yet again, Trump doesn't have what he says he has. So explain to us in plain English why the government side needed or wanted to prove that as supporting evidence to their larger fraud case.
Well, I think they're trying to show that he was in a cash crunch and that he needed these lower rates, that he was desperate for cash, and it all mattered. So they're sort of starting to, they're just laying out that story as part of his, I guess it would be his intent as to why this was going on behind the scenes, and then I'm looking at it both from that. It's interesting just to see what, in court to be laid out how much cash he had on hand, but then moving that forward, that he doesn't have the sort of cash needed to meet this fine if it comes down without selling any assets.
Yeah. Let me bring in Andrew Weissman to that point. Andrew, there are people, some of them may even be watching, who don't need a PowerPoint presentation to prove the idea that Donald Trump lies or lies about his money. So your legal analysis of what Sue says, that this came up in court today with regard to both proving the case and is just as a big picture matter interesting if he is fined to an amount that he can't currently cover. It doesn't mean, of course, the assets don't exist somewhere, real estate or otherwise, but that's how big a fine it could be. Your thoughts on all the above?
Sure. I think those are certainly really interesting points by Suzanne. I think there's sort of two time periods. One is the time period when the loans were taken out. It is useful to show motive that Donald Trump, according to the Attorney General's office, would be facing this cash crunch. I could say another possible motive is, he's just cheap, and any day that he can get a loan and a loan at a lower rate is a better day than not getting the loan and getting it at a higher rate.
Andrew, as you know,
also is,
Andrew, there's nothing wrong with strategic frugality.
Absolutely.
Nothing wrong as long as you don't lie to the government or your clients. Go ahead,
Exactly.
Sir.
Yep, that's exactly right. So there's no crime in being cheap. If there is a crime, if it is a motive for you to then put down something false, and that is the Attorney General's argument. The second point, though, Suzanne's point about a cash crunch that might be going on now, I think is really interesting. Remember, though, that there's a couple things that he will face if he has, a fine of up to $370 million. And that is that not only could he have to sell some of his assets, but it could be forced sales. In other words, there can be a monitor and a receiver who goes ahead and actually requires that. And in order for Donald Trump to appeal, very often the courts of appeals will require a cash bond. And so that issue of can he sort of wait until the appeal is over to start paying this, that may not be an option. It may be that as part of the appeal, he has to, in fact, put up some of this money in order to take the appeal.